The focus of this tutorial is on best practices for inclusion classrooms. So we'll start with a little bit of background. In 1975, Congress passed the IDEA Act, stating that people with handicaps have the right to a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. This was called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. An important provision of the law is that students should be educated in the least restrictive environment possible, which is interpreted in an everyday language to mean being educated in a general education classroom with appropriate supports and aids. So this is what is referred to when we use the term inclusion. It's educating special education students in a general education classroom. Studies have shown that inclusion is effective. There have been many studies that have been conducted that have compared performance of students, special needs students, in a general education classroom compared to a special education classroom, in which many times the special education students have additional supports from aides. Studies have also compared general education classrooms to ABA, which is a specialized type of education program for special needs students. That's very intensive. And across the board, studies have shown that education for special needs students in an inclusion setting is as effective, if not more effective, than education for special needs students in other settings, such as the self-contained classroom or ABA programs. And in particular, when the social and emotional skills of students are being assessed, the general education classroom always outperforms the special education classroom. And reasons for this are thought to be that in the general education classroom, there's more interaction with peers. Okay, I'm just gonna start that completely over. This tutorial is going to cover best practices for inclusion classrooms. Inclusion meaning educating special education students inside of general education classrooms. We'll start with a little bit of background about inclusion classroom settings. The 1975 IDEA Act was the first time that the Congress passed a law stating how and when special education students should be educated. The full name of it is the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. And it stipulates that special needs children have the right to a free and appropriate public education. And an important provision within the act is that students should be educated in the least restrictive environment possible. And when this is interpreted in an everyday practical sense, this means that students with special needs should be educated in general education classrooms whenever appropriate. And studies have been conducted to understand whether or not general education is really the best setting for special needs students. And overall studies have shown that education of special needs students in a general education classroom, AKA inclusion, is at least as effective as being educated in a special needs classroom, if not more. So some studies have shown no difference between a general ed and special ed classroom in terms of student performance. And some studies have shown that general education classrooms outperform special education classrooms. It was also shown that special education or general education programs outperform ABA therapy sessions, which is a type of a very intense therapy, which has been shown to be effective for students with autism at helping them to improve in their many different realms of function. So general education settings are very effective for people with special needs. And in particular, when they've looked at social and emotional skills, the general education classroom outperforms the special education classroom. So the idea is that students with special needs get a lot more interaction with their peers inside of general education classrooms. And so they can build their language use and their social and emotional interaction skills much more effectively within a general education classroom. Overall, the trend has been an overall increase in how much time students are spending inside of general education classrooms. So the solid line here are the number of students that are spending 80% of their time or more in gen ed classrooms. So most of the day, they're inside of the classroom. And this has increased from 50% of special education students to about 65%. And then, of course, concomitantly, the amount of students who are spending only 40 to 79% has decreased, and the amount of students spending less than 40% in a general education classroom has also decreased over time. So overall, the trend has been to have an increase in the percentage of time special education students are spending in a general education classroom. This trend correlates with increased graduation rates. So these are the percent of students broken down by ethnicity. So we can see here that in the years 2017 to 2018, we had 73, 77, 66, 71, 79, and so on. So basically, we had a range of 68 to 79% of special education students receiving a general degree with no type of modifications to it, so a regular high school diploma. This increased from even just in 2013, during which only 55 to about 72% of special education students were receiving high school diplomas. So during the same time that we've seen an increase in the amount of time special needs students are spending in gen ed classrooms, we've also seen an increase in the number of special ed students that are graduating with a high school diploma. Now, to understand a little bit more about the different types of disabilities, under the IDEA Act, there are 13 different types of disabilities that are accounted for. There's a specific learning disability, which means a student will have a problem in a very specific area. So it can be specifically in words and reading, in being able to calculate numbers, in being able to process sounds. And dyslexia is an example of a specific learning disability. There is other health impairment. So these are students that have problems with energy, attention, or alertness. Example would be ADHD. There's another category for autism spectrum disorders. And these students tend to have problems in social and communication skills, although autism students have a wide range of the different types of symptoms they may be feeling or going through. Another category is emotional disturbance. So these are students that have problems with mental health, such as anxiety, schizophrenia, and depression. Another category is speech or language impairment. So students who stutter would be in this category, or students that have problems understanding language. Visual impairment would be problems with eyesight. This includes both people who are completely blind and those who have partial blindness or partial problems with their sight. There's a category for people who are deaf, and then another category for hearing impaired. So it's other types of hearing loss other than deafness. There's a specific category for people who are deaf and blind. Orthopedic impairments, so some part of their body is not fully functioning. An example of kids that might be in this category are those with cerebral palsy. Another category is intellectual disability. This is the category of people that used to be called retarded, and they've since rephrased that category for people. So now it's called intellectual disability. And so these would be students that have below average intellectual ability. Oftentimes they have a difficult time taking care of themselves or functioning in daily life functions, problems with socialization and communication. And one example would be Down syndrome, although just like autism spectrum disorder, there is a wide range of possible symptoms and symptom severity of Down syndrome children as well. So many children are not necessarily in these very low categories. There's also a category for traumatic brain injury, which can be caused by an accident or physical force. And then a 13th category for people with more than one disability covered under the IDEA Act. And of these different types of learning disabilities, the most common are a specific learning disability. So remember, dyslexia would be an example of this. So you have an impairment in a very specific area of learning. Another is speech and language impairment. So 19% of special education students have an impairment in speech. 33% have a specific learning disability. An example of a speech impairment would be stuttering. 15% of students have an other health impairment, again, which would be ADHD. 11% of students are classified as having autism. And then 7% with a developmental delay. 6% with an intellectual disability, which would include kids with Down syndrome. And then we have fewer and fewer in the following categories. Emotional disturbance is 5%. Those with multiple disabilities, hearing impairments, and orthopedic impairments make up the lower 5%. So there are a lot of misunderstandings about people that have learning disabilities. So 51% of the population thinks that people that have learning disabilities are just being lazy, essentially, that it happens because they're being lazy. 55% of the public believe that learning disabilities are a product of the home environment. So maybe kids watch too much TV, or parents spend too much time away from home working. Over here, the percent of people when they read the statement, children with learning disabilities are just as smart as you and me. In 2004, only 46% of people thought that that was somewhat accurate, 30% believed it was completely accurate. So the numbers have gone up a little bit, where now 48% believe it's somewhat accurate, and 33% believe it's completely accurate. 99% of educators believe that kids learn in different ways, so that's kind of good news. We've gotten that message across. And 79% of Americans believe that students learn in different ways. Some inaccurate attributions for the cause of disorders. About a third of people were wrong in the cause that they attributed a learning disability to. 22% believe it's because kids are spending too much time watching TV. 31% believe it's due to poor diet. 24% believe learning disabilities are caused by vaccinations. And then 1/3% believe that early childhood parent-teacher involvement with the child can lead to a learning disability. So these are a lot of different types of misunderstandings that are out there in the world about learning disabilities. So what we know about the brain is that the brain has specific functions in specific areas. So there's parts of the brain that are specialized in processing visual information or processing sounds, processing motor information and touch, which is called somatosensory information. There are parts that are specialized in reading comprehension, parts that are specialized in being able to speak and understand language. And so what can happen is, especially with someone that has a specific learning disability, you may have a specific area of the brain that is still underdeveloped, or maybe has formed slightly different connections than an average brain. So certain regions of the brain have specialized functions. So say if somebody has a stroke in a certain area of the brain and you have damage to that area, you're going to lose a very specific function, such as being able to see color or being able to recognize faces. These are all specialized functions of small specific areas of the brain. There are also connections that are typically form between specific regions of the brain. So here in red, you see that this area of the brain, this area and this area tend to form a network with each other, which means they tend to act together and light up together. And the neurons in those areas are actively communicating with each other. The areas in yellow typically tend to be communicating with each other. The areas in purple communicate with each other, and the areas in blue are communicating with each other. So these are called networks. They're often called default mode networks. And so what happens in some people that have learning disabilities is these networks could be formed a little bit differently. So their connections between different regions of the brain can be altered. Some people that have learning disabilities might have changes in a specific area of the brain that has a certain function, like language comprehension, reading comprehension, speech. These are all specialized areas of the brain. And then importantly, when we learn something, so basically throughout our entire life from the time we're born, we're constantly learning new information, and the connections in our brain are constantly reorganizing to represent what we have learned. So this is a lifelong process. And so another thing that can happen in people that have learning disabilities is that their brains cannot reorganize as quickly or as effectively as an average typical brain. So they call this synaptic plasticity. And for most people, what this may mean is you just have to, it takes them a little bit more time to form memories and form stable connections of information. But what's very important to understand is that each person's brain, although it has similar types of organization, so those roles that organize our brain are going to be similar, your brain is going to be very specific to you and everything you've experienced in your life and everything you've learned in your life. So for instance, people that are bilingual early in life versus people that are bilingual late in life, the area of the brain that represents language is going to develop differently, and it's going to look different and function slightly differently. Similarly, if you play an instrument, over here, these are musicians, and these are non-musicians over here. So if you play an instrument, your brain, the part of your brain that represents your hands and your fingers, and the part of your brain that understands sounds and music are going to develop differently, and they're going to look and function differently than somebody that does not play music. And then also, these are just average people, and areas in your brain represent specific parts of your body or specific parts of vision. So one part of your visual cortex, it responds to pictures of a body. Some parts respond to pictures of a face. Some respond to lines or to objects. And so if you were to map out a person's brain, your brain and your best friend's brain, you're both going to have parts of your brain that represent each of those things. However, exactly where those are being represented is going to be a little bit different, and the exact organization of those areas is going to be a little bit different. So this is kind of summarized in the word neurodiversity. So among normal people, there's always quite a bit of variability in how we develop, how our brains develop, and essentially everything we experience throughout life is going to change how our brains are functioning and developing. Okay, so getting back to, right, so we have kids in our classrooms now, our general education classrooms, that may have learning disabilities or special needs in some way. So how do we teach them? So I've broken down from some specific examples for different groups. And so according to studies, for autistic learners, some of the best modifications or combinations you can make to the classroom are to have very clear organization and clear expectations, because sometimes students with autism have a hard time understanding what they need to pay attention to in their environment. So if you make the expectations very clear, it makes it easier for them to learn and to focus on what they need to focus on. So this can include organizing spaces in the classroom. So if you have an area for art or an area for maybe getting up and doing hands-on activities, an area for quiet activities, you would organize your classroom space accordingly to make it easy for the students to understand what the space is being used for. You can have items labeled. You can give students printed checklists of activities. For students that maybe have a difficult time focusing, you can also integrate timers if they do not have problems with anxiety as well. Anxiety with a timer may not work very well. Second is to use a lot of visual supports. So things like having a printed schedule, even though you go over the schedule with the class, it's good to have also a printed schedule you can give to students. Using study guides with highlighted text, using graphic organizers to help students pull out main ideas. Number 3 is priming. So because sometimes students with autism have a difficult time knowing what to pay attention to and may get off task a little bit, you want to let them know beforehand what's going to happen. So if you're going to have a big project due in 2 weeks, you can start priming your students 2 weeks prior. Hey, we're going to have a project coming up. Start thinking about it, start writing things down. So let students know beforehand what's going to happen. That's what priming is. Using reinforcements, which is praise and reward for meeting a goal. And this can be specific for each student. So each student might have their own set of learning goals. So try to find moments to use specific praise for specific actions and tasks that the student has taken. And then modifications to curriculum when necessary. And these are for autistic learners. For students with Down syndrome, again, we see that using a lot of visual supports is very important. So this can include using a lot of pictures. You can incorporate sign language into your curriculum, using a lot of visual prompts and reminders. It's important to start with some tasks that students can be successful at. So this is where knowing your students will come into play. But if you can start off students with a task that they can accomplish independently, and then you will increase the difficulty of the task from there on out within the lesson. Give students a lot of opportunity to practice. So repetition doesn't necessarily mean write the sentence 5 times, but find ways to repeat the content in different lesson plans and different contexts. So students are coming across these ideas over and over. So they're getting practice and repetition under different contexts. Allow some time for processing. So they may need a little bit more time to process instructions and to organize themselves in class. And then also help to promote recognition. So Down syndrome kids are fairly good at remembering once they get a prompt about the information. So they have a difficult time pulling something out from long-term memory stores, but if they have a little bit of a prompt to help them remember, they can then continue to recognize and work with the information. So give enough context or visual supports to promote recognition of concepts or words. For students that have dyslexia, you should use large fonts and don't crowd a page with too much information. Nowadays, if you have tech in your classroom, there's a lot of modifications you can use, like podcasts or using movies to promote comprehension of a text instead of just relying on written text only. Teach using multisensory content so that the students have different ways of accessing the information. Using guides such as lists of vocabulary, study guides, and shared notes can help students with dyslexia to better prepare for class and gives them a chance to kind of study and get used to the words and the concepts. Accommodations could include something like recorded instructions or using text-to-speech technology and Spark Notes. And then again, provide frequent breaks. So students have kind of a brain break to relax a little bit. And then for students that have ADHD, you can provide fidget tools or special seat coverings that allow the kids to move around in class without being distracting to the rest of the students. You can use preferential seating to minimize distractions. So this will be specific to the student. Some students, you may have to sit them in places with certain lighting, like low lighting or maybe high lighting. For some students, they may need to sit in the back of the classroom. Some students may need to sit in the front of the classroom. So you have to kind of play around and figure out what context works best for your student, or just ask them what would help you to focus in class. Use a lot of supports for organization. So one thing that was noted for ADHD kids is they have a very difficult time organizing themselves. And so for secondary education, when you're having to go between different classes, have different books, each teacher has different requirements, they have a very difficult time organizing themselves. So if you can provide them graphic organizers, checklists, binders that will help them to organize their information. And then when you give directions, you can chunk them into smaller parcels of direction so that the kids don't start feeling overwhelmed. And then again, having clear expectations and clear class structure. So one thing that was mentioned several times is to go over what you're going to do in class at the beginning of class every day, so students know what to expect, and then it will help them to organize themselves as the day goes on if they know what to expect and they know what the class structure is going to be like for the day. And so interestingly, a lot of these different accommodations have similar or overlapping suggestions. So one is making your daily expectations very clear and having clear classroom organization. It's going to help a lot of students with different types of learning disabilities. Using visual supports was important for autistic students and dyslexic and Down syndrome students, and also will help ADHD students to organize themselves. Organization, use things like graphic organizers, clear labels in the classroom, clear organization of time and space, and then providing students time to process information, to process your instructions or questions, and allow them brain breaks or kind of timeouts just to kind of have a space where they can get through the day. So one thing that was common in a lot of students with disabilities is sometimes the world can seem overwhelming, and the amount of information that they're receiving can be overwhelming to them. And they're having to try to filter out a lot of different information, and their brains aren't necessarily as good at filtering out all the background stuff as for some of the rest of us. So the world can sometimes feel very overwhelming. So just give some space and time for kids to kind of think and have a break and a timeout. Okay, so now we're going to segue into other parts of good teaching pedagogy and good teaching instruction. So one is building relationships with parents. Parents that have children with disabilities have to go through a lot in order to make sure that their children are getting the best education possible. And so one study just surveyed parents basically about how well they're coping. And sadly, only roughly about a third of parents feel positive about their ability to cope and about their child's future and how they're dealing with issues in their education. So only 34% felt positive. Another 31% have some conflicting feelings about their child's learning and attention. And 35% are deeply struggling with their attitude towards their child's education and their own ability to cope. So parents are dealing with a lot, having to balance and struggle with a lot of different issues when they're raising a children with special needs. So one thing that a teacher can do, general education teacher, is literally just talk with parents and ask them what their needs are, ask them what they want for their children, their strengths and things like that. So over 2/3 of parents prefer talking to a teacher, 67%, or a pediatrician about their concerns. So the majority of the parents want to talk with you and have a conversation about their children. Another thing that parents have brought up in other studies as well is that at least half parents say that their students are being bullied by other kids in the school. So it's good to keep open lines of communication with parents so that you can understand what's happening with their child and how best to educate and work with their children. So a simple way to do this could be a parent survey at the beginning of the school year. You could hand it out to all of your students to get information about all of them. But basically it's an opportunity for the parents to tell you what are the children's strengths, what are some things the children are involved in, what are the parents' goals and hopes for their child, what the parents think is important to know about their children. So this would be a great opportunity to get information and feedback from the parents to help inform your teaching strategies. And then importantly, it's very important when working with students with special needs to remember that they're just people. They're not a diagnosis. They're not any different from anyone else. Their brains function a little bit differently. So first of all, it's very important to check our own attitudes and our own thoughts as we're walking in the classroom. So we should make sure that we're focusing on the children's strengths and their talents and their abilities, and not just their disabilities or their deficits. And then make sure that you have fair and equal expectations for all children. So are you lowering your expectations for children based on a diagnosis that they may have? So one quote is probably the most important influence on positive classroom relationships and social attitudes is the attitude of the teacher and the degree to which the teacher models acceptance of students with special needs. Inclusion classroom teachers must directly address the importance of mutual acceptance and support within the classroom. They must reflect their own attitudes and ability to demonstrate such acceptance. So important to make sure you have a good climate for your students with special needs is to be making sure your own attitude is appropriate and making sure that you're modeling acceptance within the classroom. Another important aspect of special needs students doing well in a gen ed classroom is making sure they feel that they're a part of the classroom. Feelings of belonging and positively affect students' self-image and self-esteem, their motivation to achieve, how well they adjust to a large classroom, their behavior, and their general level of achievement. So just feeling valued and worthwhile in the classroom can help special needs students as well. Some ways to do that would be to incorporate cooperative learning strategies, which have been research has shown that cooperative learning strategies are effective with students with special needs, both at promoting their academic growth, but also in promoting social relationships in the classroom. So some examples of cooperative learning strategies we're already pretty well familiar with, like Think, Pair, Share, Jigsaw, STAD, group investigation, and some others are Quiz, Prairie Fairy, and Numbered Heads Together. So if any of those are unfamiliar to you, you can go ahead and look up and figure out step-by-step instructions are online everywhere. But we're all pretty familiar with Think, Pair, Share, Jigsaw, group investigations. Another important factor for promoting the social well-being of students, social emotional well-being, is you can include peer supports. There are different types of strategies. There's class-wide peer tutoring, peer-assisted learning strategies, and cross-age tutoring strategies. An important key for all of this, again, is to make sure you're not promoting deficit thinking in the classroom where typical students are helping special needs students only, but make sure that there are opportunities for the special needs students to also be helping or tutoring the typical students on something. So again, this is where knowing your students' strengths and talents comes in. So you have to make sure that there's a reciprocal relationship where they're both receiving and giving help to other people in the classroom. One way to do this, if you have a student that's a little more intellectually impaired, would be cross-age tutoring strategies, where an older special needs student could tutor a younger student is one way to do that. But if you're interested, go ahead and look more into those different teaching strategies. Other strategies, again, we're already, another thing that's important is for all students, when you're doing social learning within the classroom and cooperative learning, is to make sure they know how to communicate effectively within the classroom. And one basic way that most students need help is just learning how to ask for help and tell others if they need help or if they do not need help. So learning how to give and receive feedback, listening, and appropriate self-disclosure are important parts of social strategies. So for one, for an example, a student could learn, could you help me with this? Or would it help if I read that problem out loud for you? And that's teaching them how to offer help respectfully. Accepting help graciously, thanks for noticing I need help with that. Or rejecting help kindly, no thanks, I have my own way of trying to do this. So there are different kinds of strategies you can use in the classroom. You can literally have students practice and role play, some listening and speaking strategies. And then other strategies that have been shown, the research-based strategies have been shown to be effective for special needs students in general education classrooms are differentiation, student choice, giving students a voice and a choice in the classroom, active learning, so instead of doing lectures and students taking notes, students become active in the learning process through investigation and projects. And then also community activities, so getting involved in the community in some way as part of a project. These have all been shown to support academic achievement for special education students. So in summary, the good news is that we already know all this stuff. So if any of you guys are like me, I felt kind of intimidated of like, I don't really know how to help special needs students in my class. But in fact, we are already prepared. So we know we need to communicate with parents and have good positive parent communication and be proactive and engaging in that communication. We already know that we need to have clear expectations and good classroom organization. We've already learned about cooperative learning strategies, about incorporating student voice and student choice, and about trying to use active learning strategies. And then we've already learned about trying to make sure that we assess our own biases and make sure that we're treating children as individuals and not through our own lens of bias and misunderstanding.